There are two kinds of people in this world, my friend. Those who watch the official release DVDs and Blu-rays from MGM and other rights holders with all of their craptastic amounts of issues. And those who are the fan historians. Hello, and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be going over the home video history of the third and final film in the Dollars trilogy, the iconic masterwork, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, originally released in 1966, and released, of course, in the US in 1967 by United Artists. Like all of Sergio Leone's films, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly has faced a multitude of preservation problems and video presentation problems, various issues in restoration and remastering attempts, and because it has been stuck in a variety of different versions over the years due to various restorations and presentations becoming then the new standard version on all platforms worldwide. The film has all of the issues of the other Leone films in terms of the elements being in Italy and being split between Italian and American rights holders, and being an Italian film from the 1960s shot on Techniscope with mono sound dubs for each country, but also had the significantly longer Italian release version versus the 162-minute international version that most everyone saw and was the version that we all grew up with on home video releases. And even those versions have variations of their own. Despite multiple restoration attempts by rights holders and decades of fan and other historian efforts to try and track down all missing elements about the film's production, there are still mysteries to be solved. There are still pieces that only survive in terms of deleted materials that we only have in a partial form or in stills, or only survive as severely degraded materials. So it's a gigantic Gordian knot of preservation problems that one has to cut in order to properly present the film as best as humanly possible with the elements that survive. And the reason for this video and going through this at this time is because the new Arrow video release is the first version of the film that has actually managed to do that, in spite of the many decades and attempts by others, never quite getting to that point. This is not an easy film to understand, even just looking at its releases in the home video realm. It is an extraordinarily complicated film in terms of its presentation and preservation history. And as I said, not all the mysteries have been solved, because just when you think everything's been exhausted, someone turns up a little scrap of material or some new bit of information or a new still or a piece of film, whether it's a print or a trailer, has a unique bit of material. So it's really one of those films that's not only incredibly difficult to transfer and understand its versions and elements, but there's all this baggage that comes along with it. And it's a film that you have to put the utmost efforts into not just restoring, but researching first, because without the research and getting all the materials together, you're not going to be able to restore the film properly. And that's part of the reason why the film had such difficulties across its various restorations and video masters over the decades. Like my other home video histories, this is primarily focusing on the US NTSC home video releases, which form the backbone of releases worldwide. With Leone films, where you start to have things diverge is in terms of European, or most specifically Italian, video masters that were done on their own from scanning different materials. And since the original negatives and original materials almost always reside in Italy, that's usually where the difference starts to come in. But for the majority of video releases and for the majority of the film's overall time on physical media, going all the way back to the early 1980s, it will almost always be the US video master that will be used worldwide and will form the basis of everything that is done from that. And then it's only when they would do a new master or remastering project or do a new scan that everything would get upgraded once more and we'd move a little further down the road. So there are, of course, other editions that are merely repackagings of pre-existing masters. And so by going over the primary releases, that's how you can best understand the journey of the film from the early 1980s to here in 2025 on physical media releases. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly also had a very similar releasing pattern to the other two Dollars films. It's just that it has a couple more releases and the timing is a little bit different, just due to when the various video labels would actually get to each of the films. But the overall trajectory, going from the earliest of releases to CBS Fox to MGM to the first letterbox releases and beyond, it's basically the same sort of pattern. So if you look at all three films, you can sort of trace their journey because they would all be done around the same time, but each one has its own preservation quirks and problems, which will be readily displayed as I go along with these. So GBU, for short, actually managed to get a dedicated release very early on by the Magnetic Video Corporation. Magnetic Video handled a number of titles in the early days of physical media, primarily on tape formats, so VHS and Beta, and they got licensing deals with a lot of big studios before the studios realized that home video equaled money. So Magnetic Video managed to get deals with both Fox and MGM and, of course, the United Artists Library as well. So certain select titles had very early releases, and not all of them are confirmed, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly did actually have a release by Magnetic Video in 1981, at least on VHS tape, and presumably a beta tape release as well, the same master, just on a different format. Now this, and pretty much all video releases until the MGM 2003 expansion and some of the Italian releases, would be using the international cut of the film, which was seen as the sort of standard version, and they would be just taking prints of the international cut and doing basic transfers as they went along. And at this time, most longer films would suffer the terrible fate of time compression, being sped up and thus having the higher pitched, rather hilariously poor audio due to the speed up. They would be sped up to be fit onto less amounts of consumer media formats. So if you look at a lot of early physical media releases, if a film is, especially if it's 2 hours or more, it could often be sped up and thus time compressed to fit on less tapes or laserdiscs. This even happened to for a few dollars more on most of the early video releases of that film, and that film's only 2 hours and 11 minutes, roughly 30 minutes shorter than the international cut of GBU. But it seems GBU did not suffer the time compression problem, because I've not seen that pop up in any of the early video releases I've been able to look at. And that means it was a 2-tape release, which was not very common in the early days of physical media. It had to be a longer film that was significantly longer. And so when you see some rare images of the magnetic releases or some of the earlier tapes, you'll see very quickly that they come in a generic sleeve that actually says Part 1 and Part 2 somewhere on it. So here in 1981, this is the one film of the trilogy that we know 100% for sure was actually released by Magnetic Video, and there are even some images floating around. So its real physical media debut was here on tape, but it's an earlier tape, so obviously the quality will be rather limited, and it will not have hi-fi audio, as is predated that being used on consumer formats, so it will just have linear analog mono. These are incredibly rare, as are all magnetic videotapes, and most, if they survive, are usually in really poor condition because they've been kicked around over the years. So I would like to actually be able to see the transfer on this someday, but I can only presume it's the same transfer that was used on the other early releases, as the Dollars Trilogy and most films at this time would have a good solid transfer made of whatever source they could find, and then that would be replicated usually through the early to mid 80s, before the concept of let's try and remaster films and spiff up transfers by retransferring them or getting a different source if something was really bad. That really started to take off by the mid 80s. Now when the CBS Fox label started, they started getting back titles and releasing other titles that were not part of the magnetic video deal. They first were done in what was known as the video rental library format. This meant VHS and Beta releases, typically in oversized clamshell cases, with artwork that simply said video rental library. These were tapes that could only be rented, not purchased. If they could be purchased, they were at an exorbitant price amount, anywhere between $100 to $150 or more in 1980s money. So the whole concept of selling directly to consumers had not quite taken off yet. It is said said that GBU possibly was released this way. A Fistful of Dollars was released in the video rental library, and there are some images around online. But when you get into these early days of physical media releases, it's tough to actually find physical evidence that they actually did exist. You might find listings or rumors, but until you can at least see a photo that one actually existed, it's hard to know for sure. But given that the rights were shifting back over and the films would very quickly all be released under the CBS Fox umbrella, it is likely that GBU first saw a studio release under the rental library form. Interestingly, GBU was the first film of the trilogy to actually get an official studio master and release on Laserdisc. So in 1982, which is pretty early for the studios releasing, we got the Laserdisc release on what you would think is the CBS Fox label, because it looks identical to how their releases would be. But you'll note that it actually says 20th Century Fox Video. This is what was found on all of the early Fox label releases when they were still working out the rights and how they were going to distribute things, and also handling the MGM and United Artists library. So only the early 80s releases from about 1982, like this here, will actually show 20th Century Fox, and then that would quickly just be changed over to CBS Fox on later printings of the same releases. So this has a really nice section of the original US 1 sheet artwork. It's got a really nice sort of gloss finish, which is not super common at this time. So even the jacket has a little bit fancier feel to it. But of course, it has the typical CBS Fox looking bottom bar. Another indication of this being an earlier release is that it actually has the United Artists logo. Eventually, that would just be changed to MGM UA after their buyout and deal was formalized by 1983. So when you're looking at a bunch of things that all look the same, they're not all CBS Fox, actually. When you see the 20th Century Fox Video and the UA logos on a release, that's how you know it is a release from around 1982, because it predated everything being changed in terms of logos. The rear is what you come to expect from all of the releases carrying this style through to CBS Fox releases. A good amount of text, nice printing, much easier to read, and you get more text on the Laserdisc jacket simply because it's bigger compared to a tape format. We get a couple nice images that have been nicely produced. And again, the sort of gloss finish on the jacket really helps it sort of leap off in terms of the printing. And it's amazing how well this copy has held up, because the film is spread across 2 discs and there's no gatefold. So usually when you find copies from 1982, the corners are blown out because the discs have been tossed around for all these years. So I was very surprised to find a clean copy of this. And it's also not a very common Laserdisc pressing, simply because it is from 1982 and it's significantly early in the film's lifetime on home video. Now, of course, this release being early for Laserdisc means it only has analog sound. So it is the original mono mix and Laserdisc analog, which is good enough quality for the time period, but LD analog was always outclassed by hi-fi formats when they were introduced on tape. So a Laserdisc analog mono track will be technically inferior to VHS or Beta hi-fi sound. The overall transfer will be the same, and Laserdisc, of course, has better picture quality than VHS or Beta, so that's the sort of trade-off. The master is, of course, pan and scanned, but it is a direct scan of original elements. Typically, these would be release prints and interpositives. Whatever was in the best shape that they had on hand, that would get scanned and transferred. And sometimes you get lucky and you get a really, fantastic for the time, hands-off presentation in picture and sound. And like the other 2 films in the trilogy, that's the case here with GBU. In spite of it being pan and scanned and a 1982 release, this is a surprisingly good-looking disc with solid enough color. Obviously, the aspect ratio is a problem, and the film is softer than it would be, and a good deal of the images are compromised due to the panning and scanning. But for the time and what films were like in this day and age in terms of home video, it's surprisingly good. And the audio is the original English mono mix, and it's pretty much left alone. It, of course, has inherent defects and wear and noise and pops and ticks and things, but it's basically as if you're at a repertory screening of a well-preserved original print of the international version, and the audio doesn't really have any heavy processing on it. So this is really only one of 3 versions of the film on home video where the English mono mix sounds as good as it should. The mono mix has been remixed and reprocessed and overprocessed so many different times that it can be difficult to actually find an untouched or healthy sounding version. And again, this one is actually one of the best. I think there's really only 3 that are really good on home video, and this is one of them. This master would then be transitioned over into the other consumer formats of the time, CED, VHS, and Beta, but they were staggered out a little bit differently. The CEDs apparently both came out in 1983. CED was the short-lived, infamous RCA format where the disc was inside a plastic caddy. It would be extracted into a player and the transfer read by an actual stylus like it was a vinyl record. It was prone to playback issues and basically bankrupted RCA, and it did not go well. So it was probably the worst video format for reliability, but has a really dedicated fan base these days. But the original RCA covers for their releases, they are quite collectible. And for GBU here, we have another iconic circular design cover, this having a sort of light brown tan aesthetic to sort of, I guess, go for a sepia tone look. And then instead of the fancier, more stylized images we saw in the other 2 RCA Trilogy CEDs, this just has film images of our lead 3 characters, but it's a really nice looking cover for this time, and nice and attention grabbing and very collectible. The rear continues this aesthetic with the circle shifted up, featuring more images of the Civil War battle, and just to accommodate the text on the bottom. But like a lot of early media releases, there are some fun errors you can spot, because it's very clear that one of the images is actually from the finale of For a Few Dollars More, and if you look closely, it does spoil the ending of that film. But you'll also note that over on the side it says disc 1 of 2. That's because this film was also spread onto 2 discs, so all the early releases were actually multiple discs or tapes. A lot of CEDs would have to do this due to its limited run times per side, so that meant you had to actually put the caddy back in, extract disc 1, and then pick up disc 2 and do the same process, and keep in mind which was which, because the only way to differentiate was that the images would be a little bit different, and you had to look and see which number caddy you were holding. Otherwise, you'd always mix up and only have part 1. And if you're looking for copies of the film, you have to find both CEDs, because if you don't, you've just got half of the film. This would be very quickly replaced, apparently in the same year, by the CBS Fox reissue. This takes the same artwork as the 20th Century Video Laserdisc release on front and back, just tweaked to fit the CED form, and now saying CBS Fox, as it's a 1983 release. It's the exact same transfer, it's just updated and now under the official studio banner, so that means the RCA version is not only more collectible for its unique art, but it is very collectible like all the RCA early releases, because there's just so few of them, and they were quickly replaced by the CBS Fox sticker version. When CBS Fox brought the film to VHS and Beta formats, it followed in the same style as how they released other films. It was released in 1983 first in what is known as the big box design. This is where you have the traditional CBS Fox cover and an oversized slip box, and then the tray slides out to the right with the tape nestled inside. These are much rarer and more collectible these days than the standard reissues, but they do not have hi-fi audio, as it was, I guess, deemed not important at first. So almost always the 1983 big box tray releases will be the same transfer, just only with linear analog mono on tape. The 1984 reissues in standard sleeves do add hi-fi mono, so those technically will have the best audio on a technical level, but you have to find a tape that isn't worn, so preferably you have to find one that's sealed. Unfortunately, all early CBS Fox tape releases of the film on VHS or Beta in the big box or the standard slip sleeve are incredibly uncommon and are definitely the rarest iteration of the early Dollars Trilogy tapes to find. They usually carry much more of a price premium, and that's why I've never been able to find a copy to check its audio, because I'd be curious to compare it to the 1982 LD analog that already sounds great, and if I could find a sealed copy in particular, it'd be fantastic, because I could get a clean transfer of a technically better format that hadn't had any degradation yet. But try finding an early 1980s sealed VHS copy on eBay without paying sealed early 1980s, early rare physical media version prices, because you're competing with VHS collectors and others. So that's why I've never been able to get one to try. But that should be the best iteration of the analog mono on the original transfer, if you can find the 1984 hi-fi mono on VHS or Beta from CBS Fox. Otherwise, the artwork is the same as the Laserdisc and CED in terms of the standard CBS Fox style, just reduced to fit the tape box dimensions, and the rears, of course, slimmed down because it's no longer on a Laserdisc jacket. Something to note about the 1984 version and the reprints is that often you'll see them when they appear as a single tape version. So it seems that the film was condensed down to a single VHS tape at a certain point, with the 161-minute international version on there. It's just unknown if time compression was utilized or if they managed to get the entire film on there without feeling the necessity to time compress it. Interestingly, the film turned up a little while later, like the other two films did, in Japan on Laserdisc and video releases. These were done by Warner Home Video, but these were almost always reusing the in-print US video masters. So this is basically the Japanese version of the initial pan and scan master in their usual style, where we have an image from the film and then the sort of standard generic background, usually given a color, this given a sort of brown, tan, yellow. And then, of course, we have the Obi strip, and the rear cover also carries the same standardized design. So this should be the same pan and scan master as the initial releases, just with hard-coded Japanese subtitles. However, the Laserdisc database does list it as having a multi-audio track. This typically would indicate that each of the analog channels has a different language track. So if that is indeed the case, one would be the English, and I guess the other would be the Japanese, or possibly even the Italian audio, but I'm just not for certain. This is how the film stood for a number of years throughout the mid-1980s. Basically, once the final CBS Fox iteration happened on tape formats, those would be just reprinted along with the Laserdisc as the CED format died out. And eventually, MGM came around to start doing their first digital video transfers, or sort of spiffing up of certain titles, especially the bigger sellers. And so MGM UA decided to revisit the Dollars Trilogy alongside the James Bond films, the Pink Panther films, Ben-Hur, North by Northwest, and other big titles in their library to make superior technical releases and new transfers. For the Leone films, this meant that they went to the elements they had and also seemingly pulled in some other things. And they created new masters that started turning up on different formats, basically one at a time, and they would sort of trickle out. So by roughly 1990, 1991, you had fully new masters of each film that had improvements in transfer and technical qualities for the whole trilogy, whether you had VHS, Beta, or Laserdisc. It's just that they sort of staggered them out and put them out at different times on different formats. So GBU first saw its updated master released on VHS and Beta with the new updated, beautiful painted artwork sized down for a VHS sleeve. And these original printings would come with a fancier top that has a sort of copper reflective quality, much like the first printings of other MGM VHS releases at this time having a silver reflective banner. Now, this, of course, was pan and scan still, but it did have hi-fi mono on the tape formats and was a superior presentation in technical terms compared to what had come before. But obviously, it was just updating for the tape formats and still pan and scanned. This actual version of the film on tape formats would see the beta version eventually drop out in terms of MGM really giving up on beta around 1991 or so. So they started printing less and less in quantities. And and the later print runs of these tapes would just update the copyright information and would usually say 1990 or 1991 on the back, and sort of transition out of having the fancier reflective top of the early printings. Again, just like what you see on the tapes of Fistful and For a Few Dollars More, going to a more standardized version with the same art. However, we wouldn't get to see the full version of this new transfer in its letterbox glory until 1990, when we got the same master on Letterboxed Laserdisc. So this is essentially the full master they made, released on the superior Laserdisc format with full visual fidelity of consumer formats of the time, and the film's first ever letterbox transfer. It's obviously dated because it's a 1990 LD of a late 80s transfer, mixing and matching different print elements, which is another issue I'll get into next. But this was the game changer moment for the film on physical media, because this was the first time you didn't have to deal with all of the insanity of panning and scanning a Sergio Leone masterwork. So this was the first time you could properly appreciate the film at home, and was a gigantic leap in visual terms over everything that had come before, and was this new digital video MGM master. Of course, we have the same artwork as the slightly earlier tape releases, but now fully rendered in a really nice stylized version of the title. This is one of the best commissioned pieces of art that MGM did in the video era, and matches nicely with the art pieces they commissioned for both Fistful and For a Few Dollars More, so they go along beautifully on the shelf together. We have a nice gatefold with the MGM style of the time, having some tinted stills, but this one actually giving the full left gatefold panel over to lovely images. And then here on the right, we have more images, including a rare still from the iconic lost, deleted Socorro sequence, where you see Clint Eastwood's Blondie actually in bed with a woman, which is kind of odd because the man with no name really doesn't have any time for things like that. So it's one of the reasons I think why the sequence was cut in the first place. But getting just a glimpse of deleted material at this time, when material from the Italian version and material that was deleted was just not something you could even really read about in 1990. The rear is in the MGM style at the time, where they were starting to use more of the jacket space. Nice amount of text, but it's still obviously designed around just mixing and matching VHS parameter sizing and just putting the text over here, making everything bigger. We have some more images, but interestingly, they're in black and white. You'll also note that there's no listing of chapter stops, because this is an earlier MGM LD, so that means it doesn't have chapter stops. So that's something you'll run into with the standalone letterbox LDs of the trilogy. But this also has the all-important digital PCM track, so it has the original English mono mix from a mystery source that MGM transferred that had extremely good and high quality for the original mono mix, and is why this disc remains worth its weight in gold today in terms of its importance, which is for its audio track. So really, this was the next leap forward after the first initial home video master, because it was letterboxed properly for the first time. It was a cleaned up transfer. It was using newer or different elements that were in better condition, but also it was transferring a new audio source, which is really the bedrock of how the English mono mix has been preserved even now in 2025. So the audio track on this release is unbelievably important. No one really knows what the audio source was, whether it was something tied to an inner positive, but it seems to have been some sort of master element. It's not perfect, but the fidelity of it is about as good as you can possibly do with the elements that survive. And that's why this Laserdisc audio was used so prominently in the Arrow video restoration, not to mention the fan captures and syncs that were used on Kino Lorber's UHD release. So this release is important to have in your collection, if only for the all-important audio track in its original untouched form when it was presented here. Now, of course, this being a mixture of different prints, this is where MGM's restoration efforts first become a sort of problem that will recur with the film basically until now in 2025. Because what they seem to have done here for this master is taken the international cut print that obviously was the 1967 US print and at least mixed it with pieces of an Italian print, or taken an Italian print and mixed it with the US version, or tried to conform a transfer of an Italian print to the English mono, because, and the dead giveaway here is that when you're watching any version of this master, when we get to the iconic freeze frames, they're all in Italian. So instead of writing out the good, the bad, and the ugly when we get the character freeze frames at the start and end, the text is in Italian. So you see il buono, il brutto, il cattivo. The first time you see that when you're watching this, and I guess especially back in the late 80s, early 90s when people were first getting this, that really threw people because, back in 1990, the internet wasn't really a thing and there were no video forums to go on and say, what the heck happened? So I can only imagine MGM got a number of really concerned letters saying, why does my disc have Italian on it? What happened? And I'm sure they got a response of no response or please leave us alone, which is the response I got when I wrote them in the DVD era, because yes, I was that nerdy kid who wrote MGM about some of their preservation choices on this film and Leone's other films. But that is the particular quirk of this master that is pretty well known in the fan and video community. And the reason for that is because they were mixing and matching different prints together. That didn't really affect this transfer all that much outside of the freeze frame captions, but it did mean that it no longer 100% matched the edit and frame count of the international cut, as fan historians later were able to prove by comparing to surviving preserved international cut prints and other versions. This master and the later 1998 master had quirks and issues, so if you take this, you basically have to add back in some frames of the international cut to fully recreate the international cut. So this is technically not 100% the 1967 international cut of the film. It's basically, I'd say, 99.9% the 1967 international cut, but not quite 100% there. So technically this is the 1988/1990 MGM cut of the film. So that's just another part of the film's never-ending history. There are not just multiple versions, there's multiple versions of even video versions. But this disc is truly important, and if you were only to have one older release of the film, it should be this 1990 Laserdisc presentation. So this master became the standard version of the film, and what you saw after 1990 were a number of reissues, but typically they were just the VHS rebranded and with slightly simplified cover artwork, of course still being a dual VHS set because it was a longer film. And then that would be kept in print alongside the standard 1990 Laserdisc. However, in 1993, we did see a particular LD upgrade in terms of the Clint Eastwood Trilogy box set. This brings together the 3 standalone letterbox Laserdiscs in MGM's traditional lift-top value box, where they would take multiple films and put them in a nice handy-dandy box. You get some unique artwork that is exclusive to the box, however, the discs inside carry the exact same transfers. So these are the same letterbox transfers with the same PCM mono audio, they are the same spiffed-up late 80s, early 90s MGM masters, and the only real difference in terms of the box versus the standard releases is that you get them all in one box and you get unique artwork. Inside, you have a single page insert with the chapter stops for all 3 films. This is the other difference on the box sets, that the releases actually have been encoded with chapter stops here. When you compare the MGM box sets to standalone pressings of the same masters around this time, typically the box sets would come out a little bit later, and every once in a while you might find a little tweak. Typically, if they didn't have chapter stops, they would be chapter encoded on the box set versions, and usually that's the only sort of difference. every once in a while, if there was a little tiny flub or flaw in the standalone earlier pressing, that might be caught and corrected for the box set version. But really, I can only think of that happening on Thunderball when you compare the 1989 Laserdisc to the slightly later Connery Collection Volume 2 version. But here on the Dollars Trilogy, you now have all 3 films with chapter stops, and then on the rear, you have some more images with the text write-up and credits of each. And inside you just have the discs and the traditional MGM sleeves, with GBU itself starting on side 6. Another cool thing is that the films are on individual sides, so you don't have the problem like some MGM box sets where the next film will actually start part way through a side. That happens on some boxes. But typically, the only other trade-off of the box sets is that most Laserdiscs that were standalones would have the final side be in the better picture quality CAV format to give you an extra uptick in picture quality for the big action climax. And the box sets typically would not do that. But here, this set is pretty much replicating the standalone pressings, just now with chapter stops and unique artwork. So if you just want the trilogy in these masters in its best form, you can get the standalones or the box set. But the box set is much harder to come by as it was printed in much smaller quantities, so you're usually able to get these standalone pressings for a fraction of the price of the box set version. It should also be mentioned that the Laserdiscs do include the original US trailer of the film, and that's really the only supplemental feature, and that's basically all you could expect for a MGM Laserdisc at this time, is that it might include the trailer if it survives in good quality. In 1993, Japan got a Letterboxed Laserdisc reissue by MGM UA, and this is yet another version of the 1990 Laserdisc mastering. So this is simply a slightly spiffed up package with new gatefold and revised version of the key artwork. So the Japanese release, of course, has an obi strip, which is given this nice maroon color. The key artwork is really sort of resized for VHS dimensions, as the sides of the jacket are given to what is actually a sort of dark green color, but at least they gave it a sort of stylized torn edge on either side to make it look like the key art is sort of a torn wanted poster. Then we have the title in Japanese, of course, so it's a fancier cover than what we got in the US on the 1990 release, but otherwise the same key artwork. The gatefold is pretty straightforward, but looks relatively nice. Got a sort of basic yellow background. We have some text about the film, of course, in Japanese, with some black and white stills and imagery. The rear is a collage of images, but actually looks quite nice because they're in color and they're very nicely printed. We have the information on the bottom about the transfer, and that this has the English mono and PCM. The only difference here is, of course, it's got hard-coded Japanese subtitles as you watch the film. So that's the major difference here on this release. So this is a really nice, very uncommon release. You don't often see it or see it discussed. It's got nice custom artwork and a new version of the key artwork, but it is still the same 1990 Laserdisc mastering. So essentially this is just getting you a much rarer version of the same disc, just with hard-coded Japanese subtitles. So after this point, the film was only available in the Laserdisc standalone, the Laserdisc box set, and then the newer printings of the VHS release in this same master. Eventually, MGM would do one final sort of in-between master push of the films, and that was a release on VHS. So that turned up in the 1996 VHS release of the film that hints more with its cover at getting towards what we would see for some of the DVD covers of the Dollars Trilogy, but seems like it was one final VHS issue of the pre-existing master. In 1998, MGM revisited the film again as part of their refresh attempt on the Dollars Trilogy. In 1996, they had produced a beautiful Laserdisc of Docusucker, Leone's most challenged and troubled film, that saw almost all of the footage get restored and have a lovely new digital video transfer. So that film was finally, about 90% complete, and had a nice transfer, but for some strange reason, MGM only released a Laserdisc of it. A DVD was not released until 2003, but that was only a British Region B PAL format disc. They moved on to the Dollars Trilogy, or were working on it concurrently, by once again going back to the elements they had and looking for new elements and trying to make spiffed up new presentations for more deluxe Laserdisc, but also with an eye on the newly emerging DVD format. DVD really took off in 1997, and we very quickly saw these new MGM presentations of the Dollars Trilogy turn up on DVD. But GBU was seemingly the one that they worked on first and put the most effort in, and so that actually managed to see a final release on the Laserdisc format. So here is the 1998 late release Laserdisc of the MGM 1998 version of the 1967 international cut of the film. This is already getting complicated, isn't it? This is essentially the same thing that we saw turn up on their DVD release of the film, just on the older format, but with a superior lossless PCM mono track versus the DVD only having lossy Dolby Digital. And since this is a late release Laserdisc compared to an early DVD that's cramming the whole film onto a single disc and can suffer digital compression issues, the Laserdisc on a good setup can actually look better, and I think does look better than the original DVD. The only real difference visually is that that disc is actually an early anamorphically enhanced DVD, so on a 16:9 display you will actually have an anamorphic image, as opposed to the other $2 Trilogy DVDs and this Laserdisc still being non-anamorphic 4:3. But this is a really great late release disc in terms of the picture transfer, and also very uncommon because it was done in limited quantities. And like pretty much all late releases from a studio, it was actually handled by Image Entertainment and not MGM themselves. So that's why this disc is very uncommon, and it does have some nice unique imagery on the back. So it's got a fancier cover design than the DVD does. We, of course, have the film broken up into 3 sides with plenty of chapter stops, so this is definitely the spiffiest it has ever been in terms of presentation on a physical media format. But what's important here is that we do have extra features. Of course, we have the reappearance of the original trailer, but side 4 has additional footage from the Italian version. So this was the first time that American audiences could see all of the footage that was in the primary Italian release version. These are all the pieces that were reincorporated into MGM's later 2003 edit, just without sticking the grotto scene back in, which was only in the premiere of the film. So this was a really welcome treat. And these are, of course, in the original Italian mono with the original sound effects and everything. And here we get them with PCM Italian mono. The only problem with the Laserdisc presentation of these scenes is that they have no subtitles. So you're stuck watching the new 1998 master with better audio than the DVD, but you get to the Italian scenes and you're so excited to see them if you haven't seen them before, and if you don't speak Italian, you don't know what's going on. I mean, you can get the gist of it, but that was a major oversight on this release, that it didn't include subtitles, and the DVD actually did. So that's the major difference on the Italian scene materials. But still, getting these here and on a release in 1998 was the major draw of this on Laserdisc and DVD. Of course, this has a new rendering of the lovely late 80s, early 90s video artwork, and of course, this is just resized for a Laserdisc jacket as compared to the slimmed down DVD version. Now, the other difference between the Laserdisc and the DVD, even though they're the 1998 version and the exact same transfer in terms of the same digital video transfer, somehow things got goofed up, and there's a shot or two that are not on the Laserdisc that are on the DVD. So technically, the 1998 master of the film, which is the MGM 1998 version of the 1967 international cut of a 1966 film, has two versions. So you have the Laserdisc version and you have the DVD version. There's a slight difference between the two in that one has shots that should be in the other one that are just missing for some strange reason. So that's another reason why the Laserdisc is important, because it's a unique edit of an edit of the original film. And like I said, the status of this film gets ever more complicated the more you dig into it. And it should also be said that the 1998 MGM Master, at least in one sequence, makes some different editing choices of its own. For some reason, the order of shots is changed around to a significant degree during the sequence where the gang that Tuco has gotten together is trying to sneak up on Blondie and ambush him while he's cleaning his gun in his hotel room, just before, obviously, Tuco comes in through the window. Well, when you look at the film on older releases and the international cut and basically all versions of the film, it is a certain way, but the 1998 master reverses some of the order, so the edit is actually different and pretty much unique to the 1998 master, meaning that it's a particular video iteration of the film that does not reflect the original film nor the international cut of the film, so it's its own unique thing. So the 1998 version cannot be considered a proper representation of the original film. It's just the 1998 version of the 1967 international cut of the 1966 film. So, and again, you have to keep in mind, the Laserdisc and the DVD are slightly different. So the 1998 version comes in two slightly different flavors. I told you this stuff was complicated. It should also be noted that the 1998 LD has no gatefold. So unfortunately, you're going to come across a copy with, more wear on the corners and seam splits and creasing in the jacket. So like most late releases, you'll want to try and find a better condition copy, but any copy is difficult to find. And like other late releases, this has a very thick, high gloss finish on the jacket. I don't know how well it comes across. So it has a nice premium feel. It's definitely a Laserdisc that you'll want to track down if you're a completist or a big fan of the film, and it's nice having the Laserdisc version with PCM audio of the 1998 version, and also having the Italian scenes on Laserdisc with PCM mono, and having the slightly different Laserdisc cut of the 1998 master. We also got the DVD release of the film in 1998 with the same revised cover art, now slimmed down for a DVD case, and of course the original versions were packaged with a nice booklet and also available in a trilogy collection called the Man with No Name Trilogy. This is one of the later reprintings with a slightly modernized rear cover in terms of more modern copyright information, so it's not quite as fancy as the original pressing, but everything else remains the same. And we have the same disc inside, which is a little plain, but at least solid enough for the disc label. Now, the real draw of this release was that you finally got the film on a single disc, that you didn't have to worry about changing tapes or flipping a laser disc, so you could watch the film straight through. It is the new MGM 1998 master. It is once again mixing and matching print elements, but now the freeze frame captions are actually in English, and the picture quality is technically improved over the old late 80s master. The color timing is different as well. It may not be fully accurate to the original sources, but it's very good for the time and was a technical improvement in overall picture quality. And as I said, the DVD was the only one of the trilogy of DVDs that came out around the same time that was actually anamorphically enhanced. So this was the one that would play nice with anamorphic displays once you got a 16:9 television and were stuck watching the other two films in non-anamorphic quality. Of course, we only have a lossy Dolby Digital mono track as compared to the Laserdisc version having a lossless PCM track. So there was the trade-off, in addition to the DVD being a single disc from 1998, and obviously having to squeeze the whole transfer onto that and potentially running into some compression issues. But this is one of the best presentations of a longer film on an early DVD I think you can find. It's very no frills, but I've always enjoyed this presentation, and this was really the master I first grew up with and first experienced, so I have a lot of nostalgia for it. The mono mix, in terms of the 1998 presentation, is very good, but it has been hit with a little bit of audio processing compared to the 1990 Laserdisc, so it is not as good. Plus, the 1998 version does do that weird thing where it changes the editing of one scene. So, again, you have to keep in mind the 1998 version is its own thing. It's not actually the international cut of the film. Plus, we do have the inclusion of the Italian scenes here with the sort of basic interactive menu, which was another selling point of the DVD format. Here, you can view the Italian scenes and, of course, actually view them with subtitles. So you can actually tell what they're saying as opposed to the Laserdisc, forgetting that little thing that actually is kind of important. But it's still kind of a novelty to go back to this and see the nice basic menu and how MGM was trying to make this a fancier release for it being an early DVD. But this is definitely the most impressive of the Dollars Trilogy first DVDs, and definitely a nice thing to hang on to just to preserve the 1998 version and have the extra Italian scenes the way they were first presented to us here in the US. If you're trying to find the 1998 DVD, you do have to also check the actual disc itself, because when MGM did their expanded version, they developed this really alarming and frustrating habit of printing more copies of the 1998 cover with the updated information like this, but just putting the 2004 DVD inside of it. And so even to this day, if you purchase what should be the 1998 release, you have to scrutinize because MGM would just mix and match things like crazy. So you can still get what you think is the 1998 DVD, only to find, even taking the plastic off and finding it's the 2004 DVD in disguise. I ran into that myself more than once when I was trying to specifically get the 1998 DVD as a physical copy. And imagine being the kid trying to return a DVD to the store and explain the fact that the studio is actually lying about what version of the film and what master of the film it was, and that there were multiple cuts of the film, and trying to explain all this stuff to somebody at a Walmart. It was not easy. I managed to return it, but I was that strange kid. I actually did manage to return the deceptive, not 1998 MGM DVD and repurchase the same film and actually scrutinize and make sure it was the 1998 DVD in the 1998 artwork. So that was how the film stood for the next 5 years. The 1998 Video Master from MGM became the standard version in print on all formats and television broadcasts. It, of course, was also pan and scanned one more time, this for television broadcasts and the final VHS release, which just took the 1998 Master and gave us one final pan and scan presentation along with the other two films. The 1998 version was not, of course, the international cut 100%, but it was a technical improvement over the pre-existing late 80s master, and at least got a nearly appropriate version out there in circulation. In 2003, MGM decided to do a full restoration project and do a new scan of the film and try to pull all the various elements together, in addition to restoring the film's soundtrack. This was done with financial support and assistance from several notable donors in terms of other companies, with the biggest one being the AMC channel. And so MGM premiered their 2003 extended English language version restoration in that year with a new batch of 35mm prints that were shown in theaters. And these became what was shown at art house and repertory theaters in terms of rare print screenings. Now, this 2003 MGM effort was an attempt to reconstruct the full-length Italian version of the film with an English soundtrack. And since the other scenes had never been dubbed as part of the original English recording sessions for the actual dub, that meant having to either use the Italian mono and just have English subtitles, so you would have the original sound design of the mono mix preserved, but people would then have to read subtitles and have basically a hybrid mix of English and Italian. Or you would would have to go in and do a new English dub specifically for those scenes and try to make it match the original English dub as best as possible while retaining the original sound effects. They opted for the latter and actually brought back Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach, along with a voice impersonator for Lee Van Cleef and a couple other voices for some of the incidental dialogue in those scenes. And so you have the very obvious disconnect of a significantly older Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach plus a not necessarily always the greatest vocal impersonation of Lee Van Cleef, but it's passable for what it is. But it's a very jarring experience. The voices don't match, and it would have been much better to stick with the original Italian and just have subtitles. But one can understand why they took this approach. The real problem wasn't necessarily the voices. It was that various factions involved in this process demanded a 5.1 multi-channel remix as modernized as possible, and this meant taking an intricately designed single-channel mono mix from 1966 that had been, of course, dubbed into English for the 1967 international mono, and bringing it into 5.1 multi-channel and tearing apart the original sound design, replacing all the effects, particularly all the gunshots, with brand new, modernized sound effects that were horribly out of place, tearing apart Leone's carefully designed sound design, and on top of that, you had these grating sounding new voices. So it is one of the worst desecrations of a sound mix that has ever been done, and ever since 2003, this version has haunted all of us Leone fans and every fan of the film. The voices are one thing, the changed sound effects and destruction of the original sound design is another. All of this happening in the same remix, now spread out into multi-channel and given LFE enhancement and surround activity when it was never designed for that. All of these factors combined, on top of now having varying levels in terms of the mixing of the music and the sound effects and the dialogue, it basically tries to modernize as much as possible and results in a sonic nightmare that should have never been released. However, it must be stressed that the whole reason for this 5.1 remix monstrosity existing is that some of the people paying for the restoration insisted on it. So it was not left for the restorers to actually do a proper mono mix preservation. So from this point onward, the original audio of the film became either secondary or missing entirely. And if it did appear after this point, it would usually only appear in severely compromised versions, as I'll get into with the media releases going on from this point. You also have to look at the edit and the runtime of the 2003 MGM version. They called it the Extended English Language Version, which is an appropriate name because this is not the Italian release version, nor is it the international cut. It's basically the particular 2003 cut MGM made after deciding on certain things with the elements and items that they pulled together. So what the 2003 edition really is the international cut with pretty much everything that was in the Italian theatrical release version reinstated with this horrible new remix with the terrible sounding new voices. Of the voices, really only Eli Wallach is giving it 200%, and even in spite of his advanced years at that point of recording, he's still really giving it 200%. So that's really the only takeaway that's good from the remix, even if the audio, because of the just difference in age, is jarring every time you hear it. Most of the deleted materials that were long missing and only survived in stills or partially survived, those were not really addressed or really discussed much outside of talking about them a little bit in the supplements they made for disc releases. So essentially what they did was to do a version of the Italian theatrical release edit, except they did not include the uncut entirety of the torture sequence in the prison camp when Tuco is being beaten and the song is playing to cover it up. This was because they felt the material was too damaged and they couldn't create something consistent with the rest of their restoration masters. So it remained the cut version of the torture sequence. But what really was the bone of contention here, and what made it not at all a recreation of the Italian release version and and went against Sergio Leone's own wishes, is the insertion of the grotto scene. This is the scene where Tuco goes into a grotto where he has the dead chicken, and he recruits the gang members that we later see him confront Blondie with in the hotel room. And it's not at all necessary to have this scene because it doesn't serve a narrative purpose outside of something very simple. We have already seen the film for decades without this scene, and so we really didn't need a scene showing how Tuco recruited some throwaway gang members who are just going to be killed off in the next scene that they appear. On top of that, the scene goes on for a while. It dramatically slows down the pacing of the film. I would argue that some shots and even lines of dialogue don't necessarily fit 100% with the rest of the film. It's always felt jarring to me in terms of when it comes up or even just watching it in isolation. And this scene was only included in the premiere version of the film that was apparently only shown one time, and then Leone himself removed this scene because he felt it didn't work and slowed the pace down, which is very obvious when you see it stuck back in the film. So the only reason this scene should ever be included in a version is if you are trying to recreate the premiere version of the film, not the Italian release version, or if you're trying to create a version of the film that literally has every scrap of footage reinstated, including the partially surviving deleted scenes and the uncut torture sequence. But MGM wasn't doing that either because they didn't reinstate the full uncut torture sequence. So this meant that once again, MGM had made their own particular version of the film that didn't necessarily reflect any theatrical version of the film, and they had compounded it further now by doing a new transfer that had a new color timing approach and didn't necessarily get everything right, and cursed the film with this horrendously atrocious 5.1 remix from hell that should have never been released. So needless to say, it made all of us fans very not thrilled, shall we say, and this became the de facto standard once again and for a great number of years. So this became the version that was in circulation. This was the version shown on 35mm prints in theaters, and I have seen one of those prints, and while the actual film print is far better than the physical media releases they did of this version, seeing this version on the big screen with the 5.1 remix from hell is a very, very painful, heartbreaking experience. So that was an odd thing to actually witness, of seeing this version on their new print in a theater. It became the version shown on television, and of course was broadcast on AMC, and eventually we saw a physical media release the next year in 2004. So 2004 rolls around, and we finally get this new version on the MGM Special Edition DVD, and this of course premiered MGM's new art design for the films that would eventually get reused on the 2007 DVD releases of the rest of the Leone films that they controlled. Now, this comes in the oversized hard case with embossing for the title and the beautiful photo finish on the images and the really cool MGM Special Edition stamp that's actually stamped into the box. And we have this wonderful aesthetic of using color images from the films on a stark white background with white for the title, and it's just a beautifully designed package that also has the nice sort of copper effect for the other text. So I have always felt this is one of the most strikingly simple but beautiful and iconic pieces of physical media packaging for this time. And the fancy printing even goes onto the side, as the title is reflected in copper on the side with a sort of metallic finish. This is of course oversized, as it is larger than DVD dimensions, so that meant it may not necessarily fit nicely on the shelf, but it is such an impressive package to this day, and still a nice piece to have in your collection just for the physical aspects of it. On the back, I still have the original hype insert, and this of course details the contents of this 2-disc edition with the brand new supplements MGM put together for this, which still form the bulk of the legacy extras to this day. So the top lifts off and actually has disc 1 included on the inside. So it is actually sitting in a tray built into the box lid, which is why the box is so solidly constructed. It's actually quite thick and feels like a very premium box in your hands. So it's a fancier presentation of the discs themselves, and they're actually well protected. Because studios at this point still actually cared about protecting discs in fancy packages, as opposed to today where they don't give a crap about that anymore, and they'll just shove discs in cardboard slots and just call that premium packaging. We have a nice booklet that's almost given a sort of widescreen aesthetic due to how it's printed, and this very nicely includes the Roger Ebert Great Movies essay that he wrote in 2003 for the film's extended version. And his inclusion of the film in his Great Movies column was the highest praise that he could give to any film. So this is one of Ebert's essential pieces, and it is reprinted in its entirety. And then we get the cast and crew credits plus the chapter listing. So this is a, very straightforward booklet, but I've always loved the printing matching the rest of the packaging and the sort of widescreen aesthetic given to it. And all of the aesthetics and packaging design of this would trickle down into the issues of the other films and their special editions, which would also get bundled in with a simplified version of this same GBU set. But for those, we had to wait until 2007. There's also a nice inclusion of some original posters, and these are, I don't know how well you can tell, they're printed basically like small photos with really glossy photo paper on thick cardstock, and it's almost as if they've actually been placed in here. And then nicely on the back, you actually have the credit of which poster this actually is. Then the back of the case is where you find disc 2 on a similar matching tray, so both discs are nicely given the spotlight and also well protected, which is key with any set like this. So this was released in 2004, a year after the restoration was actually completed and premiered. This was a big jump forward in terms of overall presentation quality compared to the bare bones 1998 version. That was the 98 master on a very early DVD, and the only real extra there was the inclusion of most of the Italian exclusive scenes. When you started looking more closely at this transfer, though, and especially in the years to come as this was getting older, you could start to notice that this had all the hallmarks of the DVD era of over-processing films. You could tell it was a newer scan and transfer, and thus had better video quality on the surface than the 1998 DVD did, but this also had edge enhancement and its own particular color timing approach. But worst of all was that it was the MGM 2003 version, which you were stuck with whether you liked it or not, unless you held on to older copies. But it came only with the craptastic, atrocious 5.1 remix, which you were stuck with because the original English mono mix was not included on this release. So as a kid growing up, and this actually being the first physical copy of the film I was able to purchase, I purchased it the day it was released, and I watched it, and to my horror figured out what was going on when the sound was absolutely bizarre and not what I was used to, and then getting to the grotto scene being shoved in the film, and not to mention the scenes from the Italian version I had seen glimpsed when I could rent the 1998 DVD because I wasn't able to purchase that before this was announced. It was such a bizarre experience. So for me, this became a version that I was immediately not a fan of. And the only way I could watch this without yelling at the screen, essentially, was viewing it with the secondary audio option. What's important about this release is, for once, MGM actually, I guess, sort of thought about preserving the audio, because they included the Italian mono audio on this release. And there are, of course, English subtitles based around the English dialogue. So you can actually watch on this particular DVD the 2003 MGM extended version with some form of the original audio, because you're listening to the actual original Italian mono. It's not ideal for people wanting the English dub, but you're at least getting a form of Sergio Leone's audio design and the original Italian audio, which is not always found on different releases. And in fact, MGM would drop this pretty quick. The quality is not that great, so that is something you do have to deal with. But for years, the only way I would actually watch this would actually be watching with the Italian mono with the English subtitles turned on. And that's really the only way I think you can watch this, unless you can get through the 5.1 remix from hell and grit your teeth enough to get through it. The fancier packaging and the presentation of this release, along with all of the extras and new supplements, were really what made this release important and why you had to add it to your collection. So I basically stopped watching the feature disc and only had this for the cool box packaging, extras, and basically the supplements on disc 2 that I would just watch over and over. These were all, of course, produced in standard definition, but they feature a variety of really fantastic interviews, even including some with Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach as well, but you've also got producer Alberto Grimaldi, writer Sergio Donati, and Mickey Knox, who did all of the English translation for the dub, in addition to the 2 critics who did commentary tracks. Richard Schickel did one, and Sir Christopher Frayling did the other, and had also recorded commentaries for the other $2 films, and participated as basically the main participant in all the MGM extras. But I guess since this was a longer film crammed onto a single DVD disc, and already with 2 soundtracks, they couldn't fit both commentary tracks on, and unfortunately MGM decided to just give us the Richard Schickel commentary, which is a horrible commentary and a waste of 3 hours of your life you will never get back, and is a track I've listened to way too many times over the years. I do not recommend it, and it was also one of the commentaries I heard in my, sort of budding cinephile years, and it made me think that all commentaries were like that. They're not. And we finally got the Frayling commentary years later when this MGM edition, in terms of their master, was finally brought into the HD realm. So it took a long while, but, the wait was worth it. But back in 2004, MGM should have gone with that one instead of the Schickel one, but that's just something that's bugged me ever since 2004, actually. But the supplements disc is really the highlight of this, along with the fantastic packaging, and the extras produced then are really great. They also talk about the restoration process that they undertook, and you can see that they had really good intentions, but you can also see where things kind of went off the rails, and it does explain the whole mentality and methodology of the 2003 version. So all of this is still really important, and that's why it's great that these have all been ported over to modern releases. But that's why, of course, they're all in standard definition and just having to be upscale because they were originally released on this 2004 DVD. Whether you liked it or not, the 2003 master on the 2004 video master became the version of the film everywhere. And so every time you saw the film or people talked about the film, they were always dealing with the 2004 video master of the 2003 MGM version, which was their own extended edit, which was also a longer and more bloated film that I, like other Leone fans, have always felt to be an inferior film to the international cut, which is a tighter, better paced film. And while all of the added scenes are, they're all great and fascinating to watch, but they don't really add anything. They explain a few things that we already have been able to infer, so it's basically leading the audience around by the nose, and they're repetitive, and they really do drag the film down. If you closely compare the international cut to any of the longer versions of the film, I think that starts to become obvious. It becomes a different film. The pacing changes dramatically. And so the decision to drop all of those scenes, it's why they all are scenes that do the same thing. It's very quickly apparent why those particular little moments were all the ones that were targeted to try and get the runtime down. And in the process, they actually strengthened the film. But this MGM version, being the version that everybody was seeing and what was in circulation, meant that everybody got a bad impression of the film's audio because it was this horrendous nightmare 5.1 remix that should have never been done. And the film was cursed with it for decades, and it still pops up on different releases and different television airings. So this stupid remix became what was everywhere, And so whenever people would see the film, it was always this MGM version, and it became distributed worldwide in most territories and on almost all releases because they'd all be using MGM materials or actually be done by MGM. In 2007, we finally saw the release of the other films in the Dollars Trilogy in terms of special edition DVDs with the new MGM transfers and screwy 5.1 remixes. This also was done for DocuSucker, which had seen a variety of presentation problems, and that 2007 master introduced even more new presentation problems, and of course, yet another bad sound remix, but that one was a particular mess of its own because they even used censored dialogue and the wrong music cues because that film is the most cursed of all of Leone's films in terms of its preservation status. The special edition DVDs had been delayed by 2 years. They were supposed to come out in 2005 to follow up the 2004 GBU DVD. They did come out in 2005 in Region 2 with their own covers, but for some reason, I suppose a legal holdup or MGM going in and out of bankruptcy and having to get their U.S. video distribution switched over to being done by Fox. I think all of these factors may have played into why there was a 2-year wait. So there I was, the teenager, waiting patiently for 2 years for these things to come out. And that meant that they could also reissue the special edition of GBU along with them. And basically what they did was they did fancier slipcase DVD sets for the films, and they didn't really do anything differently with GBU except to simplify its 2-disc set into being a standard keep case. So the wonderful oversized hard case set was only the original pressings before 2007, and none of the 2007 releases were this same style as the oversized super fancy box. What they also did was put all the films together into a Sergio Leone Anthology collection that used the same art style but had some unique images, and it basically just took all of the 2-disc sets, put all the discs into a fold-out box, and combined all the booklets. And of course, they put this out after we'd all bought the individual releases. So I never got that, but it was basically just bringing all these special editions together. And frankly, I think the standalone packages of each of the films were actually superior and more impressive than the simplified box sets. So if you get any of these, or you want the old extras in their original standard def incarnations, I think it's actually cooler to have the original first pressings with the slip cases and, of course, the hard case box for GBU. 2 years later, we saw the film's first release in high definition in the US. MGM did a early for them Blu-ray release, and unfortunately, because this was an early format release, they basically took what they had and slapped it onto a Blu-ray disc. And this meant we got, again, the MGM 2003 edition of the film. And this was seemingly taken from the HD source master of their 2004 video master. And it seems to have also had additional degrees of digital noise reduction applied to it. So this 2009 Blu-ray was really unfortunate because not only was it an early disc of the, frankly, ill-advised 2003 MGM edit with the hideous 5.1 remix, but it was an overly processed image that also had most of the film grain completely eliminated. So it looked like an HD, soft and smeary version of the 2004 DVD master, and also showed differences in color timing on its own, even compared to the 2004 DVD. This release actually did include the DVD extras, which few MGM early Blu-rays did. They often would be feature only or maybe have the commentary track. So those at least were there, but you always have to worry about the quality of how they're upscaled and presented on a Blu-ray disc. But everything was preserved in terms of the supplements, and we finally got to hear the Sir Christopher Frayling commentary track because there was room for it on the Blu-ray disc. So we finally got that, and I think besides getting the film in some form of HD for the first time, those are the only two factors that made this release worth any of your money or any of your attention, because otherwise it was a piece of junk. And then you look at the audio situation, which is also a giant problem because the Italian mono mix was dropped. That was on the 2004 DVD. There was no reason to do this, but the Blu-ray now included a variety of foreign dubs and the stupid remix from hell now in a lossless DTS HDMA codec. To add insult to injury, MGM included an English mono track that was labeled Original Mono, and like every time they did that in this era of the 2007 and 2009 releases, it was very often not the original mono, and indeed here it was a down mix of the Craptastic 5.1 remix. So basically all this was doing was masquerading as the original audio and at least putting everything back into a single channel form, so you didn't have to hear the remix from hell in multi-channel. That didn't really do anything other than pour salt in the wound, and there was no reason to remove the Italian mono they had synced and included on the DVD, so it made this release even worse and more pointless by having no proper audio presentation. This release was met with a number of mixed reviews and fan outcry when it came out. It was not even a good Blu-ray back then, and unfortunately would be recycled and repackaged ad nauseum in various collections with the other $2 films, which received not good Blu-ray presentations that were merely updates of their 2007 special edition DVD presentations, and all those problems that existed on the special edition DVDs would carry over into the Blu-ray realm, but be unfortunately added to by the way the images would be played around with in terms of overprocessing and digital noise reduction, and even more tomfoolery to the picture and sound that was done. So this 2009 version became the standard version in print everywhere and what was seen on broadcast, and basically the new MGM version you couldn't escape from. And this version would stick around for the next 5 years, and there was no sign of anything else on the horizon. However, in Italy, this is where the transfer story starts to change there. Italian releases started to do more scans on their own and pull directly from the Italian vault elements and dealing with the Italian rights holders who had most of the materials, and they had things that MGM didn't have or didn't have access to. And in 2009, the Mondo label released a Blu-ray of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in the Italian edition, in terms of with the Italian credits and pretty much replicating the Italian release version. And it was a different scan and master entirely to what MGM did. So this had better color timing, and it had the Italian mono mix in addition to a new Italian 5.1 track as well. Other than that, it was pretty much bare bones, and unfortunately it did have transfer issues of its own. It wasn't a perfect version, but at least it was an alternative to the MGM iterations. This became a release a lot of fans would import, but you'd also have to deal with it being an earlier Blu-ray, paying import prices, and having to deal with it being another region, and it didn't have English subtitles. But it did become, in terms of the transfer, what was used in a lot of fan preservation attempts to make a better master of the film, or to sync an English audio source to it, or to basically try to cobble together your own version. And from this point onward, it became looking at using either the 2009 Mondo Blu-ray from Italy or a version of the 1998 MGM Master. And being a fan in the US, those were basically your two options, and it was much easier to just stick with the 1998 DVD, and that's what most fans who got into this issue would do. They'd just have to stick with that or track down a copy. And MGM made even that difficult because they started repackaging the 1998 DVD with the 2004 DVD inside of it. You wouldn't know until you got it home and you took the plastic off. that happened to me more than once. So that was another particular not fun aspect of trying to be a fan of this film. Finally, it was announced that the film had received a 4K scan of the original negative and surviving materials that was handled in Italy by the Ritrovata group, and this first turned up on an official release in terms of the MGM Blu-rays in 2014. First, we got the Man with No Name Trilogy updated box set that merely repackaged the craptastic Blu-rays from MGM of the first two films, and then this new disc of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with this new Ritrovata 4K master. This was fantastic news for all of us because it meant we could get away from the terrible DNR fest of the crappy 2009 MGM Blu-ray, and hopefully it might mean that they paid attention to the audio and, it wouldn't reflect the errors and mistakes and particular issues of the 2003 MGM version, and we'd finally have a new fresh scan, and it was coming from the negative, and it was going to be great. But of course, this became infamous almost instantly when we actually got to see this transfer, because this was obviously the best quality we'd ever seen the film look, but it had been given the full treatment in terms of the Ritrovata approach to the color timing. The film was now stuck in a horribly revisionist color grade that focused on basically a modernization of the colors used, with a great focus on the dreaded sort of teal and orange effect, but here it was mostly reflected in the skies going, particular shades of teal, and the film being given a very yellow sort of wash to it. Some people have even compared it to the film being, sort of urinated upon. It is just a horrible, heartbreaking appearance when you see it for the first time. And this new presentation became a never-ending source of discussion and analysis and arguing back and forth about just how bad it was. And then the fan community started trying to see if it was possible to regrade this transfer and try to remove what aspects of the baked-in horrible color timing there were. And unfortunately, even that was limited because there's only so much you could do with how the film had been treated. And you could see the great detail of the scan itself. So it was really a double-edged sword. It was so significantly better, but also so horribly worse at the same time that it kind of made the whole thing pointless. And on top of that, we were once again saddled with the MGM 5.1 remix from hell. And this disc didn't have the original mono, nor did it have the Italian mono. So it basically became a new version of how MGM had stuck the film on the 2009 Blu-ray, just now with a new scan with horrendous revisionist practices applied to it, and horrendous visuals in spite of how great the new scan was. And it just became a nightmarish experience, and I myself just never really bothered with this version again. I just had it on my shelf as another example of my never-ending pain with how the Leone films were treated by all the various rights holders. So this is the box set first pressing from 2014 with this slip box and updated artwork. There's a little bit of a matte finish, and the actual title has some slight embossing, so at least they did try to give it some slightly premium feel. Got the trilogy on the spine, and then the rear has images that have been given a glossy photo finish. So again, at least they were slightly trying, but it was nowhere near the level of the special edition DVDs. Inside, you've just got the same art on a case, and eventually the set would just be sold like this, as the slip box was just for the first pressings. On the back, you've got the technical information, which shows very clearly that it's claiming to have an English mono track, but of course, once again, it's just the remix audio. This release was supposed to have had or alluded to having the original mono mix in a lossy codec presented on the disc, but that didn't happen. And in fact, what did occur slightly later on was the film got a standalone release also in 2014, shortly after this. and it got updated with a second pressing of the disc itself. And this is what actually had the new version of the mono mix, which was apparently a new restoration by Chase Audio to try and give a better rendering of the original mono mix of the film. And of course, that would be conformed to the new extended version that MGM made in 2003, and then have the bad remix portions for the Italian scenes. However, that presentation was not great, as the audio was overprocessed and didn't sound as good as either the 1998 or original Laserdisc mastering of the international cut. So still, the 1990 Laserdisc mono was the version to beat, and this new restoration of the mono was not really bad at all. In fact, it kind of made it worse, but at least a version was on a disc. But MGM was very sneaky about how they did it, and you wouldn't know it existed unless you read forums, and then you had to check the actual disc itself to actually check the mint markings on it. And they didn't offer a replacement program or do anything for those of us who'd already bought the other versions, and so you were basically stuck having to buy the film again as a standalone and hope that it had the second pressing of the disc that had the addition of the not great restoration attempt of the mono mix. So you open the case to find the exact same identical Blu-ray discs of the first two films with the same exact labels, and then you've got the new label for the new disc of GBU. So this is the Ritrovata master, and this is the initial MGM 2014 Blu-ray. This same disc would be in the standalone version, and again, you would want to try and find that standalone version with the same art and disc label with the second printing of the disc with the flawed restoration attempt of the mono mix added. In terms of supplements, this is identical to the 2009 Blu-ray release, so there are no new supplements and there's nothing about the restoration or anything, so you'd only know information about the Ritrovata scan if you looked it up online and you delved into the forums, which were a hotbed of discussion and have never stopped because these films have been cursed for their entire release history. So this basically got us stuck with another horribly flawed video master, which became the new standard version of the film in print and in circulation everywhere. So you saw this horrible color everywhere, along with the craptastic MGM 5.1 remix once again. And the film was seemingly cursed to be stuck this way, and frankly, it was an even worse scenario than what it had been in before. It should also be noted that the Italian versions and any other release worldwide that was doing its own master would also now use the Ritrovata 4K master because, why wouldn't you? It's the best quality, but that meant their horrible color grading was now being seen on pretty much every release worldwide. Different releases might handle it differently, but this meant that this problem now extended to pretty much all versions that were available. After doing the standalone release of the 2014 Blu-ray, MGM brought together all of their Blu-rays of their Leone films into yet another Sergio Leone Anthology box set. This was released in 2015 and was a very standard affair that just brought the Dollars Trilogy together with the horrendous MGM master of Duck-You-Sucker in its Blu-ray presentation with its own outdated HD master and its terrible remix. So it basically just brought together all the MGM Leone pain into one box set again, and it was still the same exact discs as what had been previously released. Then in 2017, we finally had something different in terms of the Kino Lorber Blu-ray release. This was a 2-disc set that claimed to include the theatrical cut of the film and the international cut of the film, or the long version. Those are in fact misnomers because this actually just gave us a recreation of the 1998 MGM DVD cut of the film, and the long version was still the 2003 MGM master, and these would both use the Ritrovata 4K master with its horrible color grading. What was advertised on this release and what Kino claimed to have done was to go in and try and address some of the issues that fans were very rightly upset about. This meant trying to work on the color timing and trying to at least tame some of the crazy revisionist color that had been applied, and also recreating the international cut of the film so fans could actually finally see both versions of the film on disc, in terms of at least something that was the original international cut from 1967 and some version of the longer version of the film, and of course still having to basically just give us the 2003 long edit, but at least that would be something with all of the additional materials. Unfortunately, the Kino team behind this release kind of made everything worse, because their attempts to address the color of the Ritrovata master and its other issues were, they didn't have a lot of money and a lot of time. That's understandable. But in trying to fix the color and transfer issues, they wound up making everything worse, because they were able to dial down some of the color problems, but they accentuated other problems, and thus you had an image that now looked a bit almost kind of desaturated in a way, and the black levels appeared differently, and it was an example of 2 steps forward and like 15 steps backwards. So to be honest, you're better off sticking with the Ritrovata master the way that it was than actually looking at the Kino fix attempt, which was not the greatest. And that's not because of their limited resources and abilities and not really having the budget to do a full-scale restoration. They took the files they got and they tried to do stuff with them, but frankly, it made everything worse. And on top of this, they were claiming to actually give us the original international cut of the film as well, but they also didn't respond very well to those of us in the fan community and the fan historians who reached out wanting to try and at least help and give what assistance we could. And, it was felt among the fan community that if people could help, maybe we could all help to contribute and make this release as good as it could be, in spite of the compromises Kino was obviously facing. And Kino was, seemingly wanting to try and fix the issues that we all knew were a giant problem. The response from the label was, shall we say, not the greatest, and so a lot of us fans, and especially the fan historians, who are the preeminent ones in the community, we all kind of felt burned by this. And the eventual release came out, and Kino had used MGM's 1998 DVD as if it were a proper reference. And so the color timing was also an issue because they were using past video editions as a reference, and they also used the 1998 DVD as if it was the original international cut. So this means that the so-called theatrical cut on this disc actually follows the edit of the 1998 version, and it was conformed to that. So it's got the same weird reordering of scenes in one moment and is missing shots and frames. So disc 1 of this set is basically their 2017 master that's a compromised version of the Ritrovata 4K master, now conformed to the 1998 MGM DVD master, which itself was different from the 1998 Laserdisc master they made. So that makes disc 1 of this set a truly bizarre experience. Disc 2 is once again the MGM 2003 version, so it's basically their color and visual fix attempt of the pre-existing 2014 MGM Blu-ray of the Ritrovata 4K master. So none of this really helped anybody, but what we did get in terms of audio was the Chase Audio attempt to restore the mono mix, which was not great, but it was actually included here in a lossless presentation. So at least we got that, and you didn't have to try and track down that elusive second pressing of the old crappy MGM 2014 Blu-ray. Frankly, the only good thing about this was that we got some fantastic new extras. All the old legacy extras were ported over, but Kino did get Tim Lucas to record a phenomenal commentary for what was termed the theatrical cut, but it was really the 1998 version. This is a fantastic commentary track and just an essential listen. Also, Mike Siegel did some of his fantastic image montage pieces with tons of rare stills from his own archive, so there were a couple new exclusive extras that made this release essential for fans of the film, and these have been ported over to subsequent releases. But those new extras were really the only reason why anybody should pick up this release, or if you were really curious about Disc 1, if you prefer the shorter version of the film. But it should be kept in mind that this release was really not good, and Disc 1 was merely using the 1998 master. If that were not bad enough, all of the legacy extras had various encoding problems in terms of having frame rate issues and upscaling issues, so they were running at the wrong frame rate and had these conversion issues that resulted in a sort of herky-jerky frame rate appearance where things would just kind of move in a staggering, jerky way. These issues would also carry over into the legacy extras on the Kino releases of the other $2 films when they eventually did those, and a lot of these did carry over into the UHD reissues that they did. So unfortunately, this became a problem with the legacy extras on pretty much all the Kino releases, and so it meant that you wanted to hang on to your older releases because those at least had the legacy supplements in the correct frame rate. In terms of the packaging, we did get the original one-sheet, which was nice and made this release distinct from the other releases of the Ritrovata Master. Otherwise, it's the standard Kino design, and for the rear as well. Inside you have the 2 discs with their generic labels, and each one is labeled with what cut it is. But again, it should be noted that the theatrical cut disc is merely replicating the 1998 MGM DVD, and the extended cut is, of course, once again, the MGM 2003 version of the film. There is reversible artwork, which does give us an English version of the Italian one-sheet artwork. Overall, the 2017 Kino Lorber Blu-ray release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly became, in my opinion, one of the most disappointing physical media releases of all time, due to the claims the label made that they were going to work on things to try and fix them, and then not really doing that, and in fact making them worse. But the bigger issue was how they treated the fan community and the various discussions online with a very standoffish attitude. And in fact, for some of us in the fan community, it was hard to not feel kind of insulted. But the eventual result was such a compromised, problematic affair that even had issues in the legacy supplements and was using the 1998 master as some sort of reference. It basically made the issues of the 2014 MGM Blu-ray even worse, especially visually. So it was an extraordinarily compromised affair. The only real reasons why anybody would want to pick it up were for having 2 versions of the film, having the not great Chase Audio mono mix in a lossless container, but really the only draw of this release, and really the only reason why I picked it up, was for the outstanding new supplements. So that became the new status of the film. You technically had 3 types of releases, all stemming from the new Ritrovata 4K master with its own problems. You had MGM still repressing their same 2014 release. You had the new 2017 Kino Lorber version that was doing its own thing with the Ritrovata master and added more options, but also even more problems, plus a couple really fantastic new supplements, and also having issues with the legacy supplements. And then you had Italian and other foreign releases that did their own thing with the Ritrovata master, but pretty much left the color as is. So whichever option you went with, you were having to deal with headaches and problems, and none of them were really advisable. So for fans of the film who wanted a release, or at least a version on their shelf that was more appropriate to the original viewing experience, in spite of having video issues of its own, you were pretty much again left with choosing between the 2009 Mondo Blu-ray and the 1998 MGM Master on DVD and Laserdisc. But of course, those had their own issues. Those were already outdated masters, and that Mondo Blu-ray went out of print went very, very quickly and was something that you couldn't really find. So outside of those two options, you were having to look at living with one of the modern Blu-ray options, or delving into the world of fan preservations that did the best they could with the compromised video sources we had and tried to cobble together their own version, or try to address the color timing of the bad Ritrovata master as best as possible. So it was an absolute surprise 4 years later when Kino Lorber announced they would revisit the film on their 2021 Blu-ray and SDR UHD combo release. This was the first of the Dollars Trilogy UHD releases they would do. All of them were revisits to their pre-existing Blu-rays, which had a variety of transfer and presentation issues, not to mention disc encoding issues, and each of them was an improvement over the first Blu-ray, but to varying degrees. So we saw the 2021 release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly from Kino Lorber, again, a dual format release. And what was notable about this is that they actually did what they claimed to do the first time around in terms of the fixes, and the attempts to deal with the Ritrovata master were much more legitimate this time. They had a different production team on this release who really tried to do their darndest here. And again, while they didn't have a lot of time or money to work on this Ritrovata master that was so flawed, they were able to address the color issues as best as possible. And this time they actually did work with the fan historians and fan preservation community. And so with the assistance of those fans, they were able to use original dye transfer Technicolor sources for color references, and also for properly recreating the international cut of the film for the first time on home video. So this version only includes the international cut, and then you can look at the sequences and scenes from the longer version as a supplement. It was decided that they would just go with one cut, I guess, to save disk space and to not go to the expense of having both versions, or that they couldn't really be bothered to have both versions. It's really unclear why they did that. But to decide which version to include, they actually put a poll on various social media platforms so fans could actually vote for which cut they wanted. And thankfully, the consensus was that we wanted the international cut properly restored, because technically we'd never had that before, and it is really the better version of the film. Not to mention, I think most of us were tired of being stuck with the screwy 2003 MGM edit that was their own edit and not a particular release version of the film. So this finally gave us the 1967 international cut on physical media without any trims or missing shots or missing frames, and of course without the weird quirks of the 1998 MGM Video Master. So that in and of itself was a victory. But the color timing on this release was a real attempt to try and correct the wrongs of the Ritrovata master. They did get to go back to earlier versions of the original scan files, but not the actual raw scan files themselves. So that meant they were able to dial out a lot of the bad color, but it was still in there. If you knew the film very well, or if you were very attuned to any sort of color revisionism creeping into an image, you'd be able to tell that it was still there, lurking in the surface. It'd be in the background of a lot of the shots in terms of some of the skies, and the big giveaway is in smoke or anything hanging in the air. You could see some blue tinges creeping in still, and then worst of all of the Civil War sequences featuring Union soldiers and the Union blue uniforms. Well, they weren't quite blue. The same would go for any sort of denim or clothing. So you could tell that the screwy Ritrovata color was still there. It would poke its ugly head up here and there, but it was so greatly improved over both the original 2014 iteration and the debacle of the 2017 attempt that actually made things worse. So this is really what we should have gotten the first time around on the 2017 Kino release. It took an extra 4 years and a second release, but we finally got kind of what they were indicating the first time around. And the audio is crucial here, because instead of using the screwy chase attempt at restoring the mono, which was not good, they actually used the fan-provided Laserdisc capture of the 1990 LD and 1993 box set version, which are the same master. So this is essentially the fan-synced and provided Laserdisc mono capture on this disc in lossless quality. It's the best audio you'd had for the film on a physical media release since the 1990 Laserdisc, because it is the same audio track. But it is still the highest quality source of the English mono mix that is known to survive, and unfortunately, no one knows what it was transferred from, so that's why this Laserdisc audio is so important. So that is here on this release, and it was also given a basic 5.1 up mix to have a surround option on the disc, but it is essentially the same mono capture, just being spread around in multi-channel. It's not the greatest up mix. It's nowhere near as carefully done as, say, the Arrow up mixes that I'll talk about next, but at least it was there, and it was a purist option for those who had to have a multi-channel track. Now, this release is dual format, so you have the same presentation on the 1080p Blu-ray and the 4K UHD. The downside here is that the UHD is an SDR, as the Dollars Trilogy scans were only completed in SDR. They predated the whole HDR movement. So that led to a lot of people wondering if this release was really worth it, because it was a UHD that wasn't an HDR, and it was an older scan that they already own versions of. So this release was really most important for the work that went into it, correcting wrongs of the past. It was not a perfect release by any means, and the film still required a lot of work, but it would take a lot of time, money, and effort from somebody to actually do better than what had been done here. So this was another Band-Aid situation, but it was the most work in correcting things that anybody had put in really to this point. There have been some little fixes here and there, but nothing to address the major problems or the problems that had then been stacked on top of those problems. So this release was truly important, and it was the only one of the Kino UHD reissues that actually had this level of care. The other two Dollars Trilogy UHDs that Kino did, unfortunately, did not have the same level of care and effort put in. So if you were to have any of them, it's really only GBU that's the most important, because it was the one where a production team really tried to fix as much as they could. Now, unfortunately, it didn't extend to the issues that existed on the previous Blu-ray disc in terms of the legacy extras. All the same extras are ported over for the most part, including the essential new extras from the 2017 Kino release, but the encoding and presentation issues on the legacy extras persist on this release, and that was something that should have been caught and addressed, and unfortunately wasn't. So it meant you still had to hang on to your past releases to have the extras without problems. So this is the original pressing slipcover, which very quickly sold out and became collectible on the used market. This features the English version of the original Italian one-sheet artwork, and it is nicely printed. We do have a little bit of stylization for the spine, and then the usual generic Kino layout, but this is actually trying to at least indicate a little bit that this is actually different from the 2017 release. But as usual, Kino doesn't put a lot on their packaging, so it's understandable that people were confused about this being any different from the 2017 debacle Blu-ray. We have the same artwork on the case, except now with the usual generic Kino spine, and then the same rear cover. They did also provide reversible art, which is another foreign poster variant now with the English title applied. Inside, we only have the two generic Kino labels on the two discs, and that's it. There are no printed materials or anything, which is typical with Kino UHD releases. So that became the new standard for the film on US physical media releases. However, in terms of theatrical screenings, broadcasts on television, and anywhere else, it was still going to be the craptastic 2014 MGM Master with the Ritrovata scan and all of its revisionist color, not glory, and the horrible MGM 5.1 remix. Other territories and the Italian versions would now be jumping into UHD releases, and they would also still be using the Ritrovata scan in the way that it was completed, bad color timing and all. At least we finally had a better option that was as good as it could be with the files provided, but also not something that really was restoring the film 100% properly, and there were still the issues with the supplements, and there weren't any more new supplements added. So again, the Kino UHD was a bit of a band-aid, and it was still SDR only, so that led people to wonder if anyone would at least do a HDR upgrade. But the concept of somebody coming in and doing brand new work and restoration efforts and doing a big deluxe release was a pipe dream, because it would require the full cooperation of the rights holders and a significant budget, and it would be a Herculean effort to do because of the research involved, trying to undo all the past mistakes of the decades of screwy releases and getting as many original elements together as you could. And this is without even getting into if you were doing a brand new scan of the negative or dealing with the actual raw Ritrovata scan itself. So when Arrow Video announced that they were doing the entirety of the Dollars Trilogy in deluxe releases with new restoration efforts, with the full cooperation of the fan historian community, and trying to fix and address as many problems as humanly possible on all three films, and doing the research and going to the various vault holdings and pulling together as many elements from the studios, the rights holders, and the fan preservation community, it was a pinch me, am I dreaming? I must be dreaming moment. Now, I myself was involved in this process to a very small degree, so I was able to contribute some of my own materials and audio captures and give my 2 cents here and there. So I had a very small window into this process. So I can definitely confirm that when Arrow says that they are going to put in all this effort and describes, in their booklet, in very general terms, some of the work that went into this, they're not kidding. It's not we just tried to fix a video file. No, they actually went in and got access to the raw 4K scan files that Ritrovata made from the negative, and they started their work from there. And they also were able to get brand new transfers of the original soundtrack negative and positive for the English dub, and they were also working on restoring the original Italian version. The only issue surrounding this whole project was that relatively late in the game, the Italian rights holders decided that they didn't want Arrow presenting the Italian versions or Italian mono of For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So these two releases, unfortunately, were not able to include the Italian mono tracks or the Italian presentation versions. And for GBU, that means that they had to make the long version, but they couldn't specifically call it the Italian release version, nor could they actually 100% claim to have restored the Italian release version. But they did restore and present in various iterations every scrap of surviving footage, including some of the long-lost deleted materials that only partially survive. So here in 2025, we now have the absolutely stupendous Arrow Video limited edition of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly on both Blu-ray and 4K UHD formats. This is a 4-disc set with the beautiful limited box featuring incredible Tony Stella artwork that matches the other two releases and has the matching spine that forms a perfect design on the shelf. The rear continues the matching aesthetic with the other two releases, with wraparound artwork in the back, and lays out the contents of all 4 discs of this set. Disc 1 and 2 are the feature disc, with each disc devoted to the international cut, and then the various versions that are seamlessly branched of the long version of the film. Again, note that they can't actually call it the Italian version due to the switch made with the rights holders. Remove the slipcover to find the same art nicely printed on the case with more of a matte finish, and of course without the ratings logos. And you get more of that wraparound effect because now you're able to see the background artwork, so the rest of the art is equally fantastic. We have a secondary beautiful Tony Stella piece for the actual case artwork, and this is just like the other two releases, which also had wonderful alternate artwork. And my favorite touch is that they have nice uniform titles, but they all include the actual Italian original title as well. There's the spine, and then the rear with the supplements listed again. On the reversible artwork, Arrow includes a wonderful reproduction of the iconic United Artists 1967 one-sheet with matching text on the spine, and then a matching rear as well. Inside, we find the 4 discs. So disc 1 is the international cut presentation of the new Arrow restoration, with a fantastic trailer gallery, with some being in 4K resolution with HDR, just like the feature, plus the legacy extras in terms of the Tim Lucas commentary for the international cut. Disc 2 is featuring the long versions, and this includes the 2 commentaries done for the MGM 2003 edit, plus additional scenes and materials, including some of the rare deleted materials. So this has a whole deleted scenes gallery. But this is a masterpiece of disc encoding because this includes 5 versions of the film seamlessly branched, including what I like to term the warts and all version, which is a hidden Easter egg option to view the film restored, but also including every scrap of surviving footage, including the uncut torture sequence, which has been restored for this release in terms of as best as possible with the surviving elements, plus the mostly complete Bones in the Desert sequence, which has a reconstruction. So the 5th version on this disc runs about 3 hours and 2 minutes and includes literally every scrap of surviving footage. So this is a masterpiece of disc encoding and presentation because you've got 5 versions of the long version of the film, giving you options to view the long version however you wish, even including giving you the option finally to view it with or without the infamous grotto scene. And it includes the legacy extras for the long version, plus additional supplements without any issues in terms of the disc encoding. It should also be said that the feature discs were encoded by Fidelity in Motion and are as good as they possibly can be. Disc 3 is a Blu-ray, and this is where we get into the bulk of the new supplements, which are extensive. So this disc is absolutely stuffed. Plus, it includes all of the legacy supplements without any encoding issues whatsoever, so they are presented in full quality and look and sound as good as possible, even though a lot of them are older standard def materials. So every scrap of legacy material is ported over here, so you don't have to hold on to any of your older releases now, and there are no frame rate or encoding problems. The only issue is that the Blu-ray disc is region locked, and so are the feature Blu-rays if you get the Blu-ray version of this set. So for the Blu-ray disc, you will need to have a region-free player. Disc 4 is unfortunately exclusive to the limited edition, but it is the wonderful Sad Hill Unearthed documentary, which is all about the fan attempt and completion of their project to actually save, restore, and bring back the incredible Sad Hill Cemetery set designed by Carlo Simi and iconic at the end of the film. So this is a wonderful documentary, very well made and produced, with a fantastic presentation on this Blu-ray where Arrow has not only maxed out the bitrate, but includes the theatrical 5.1 mix that was made for the documentary, which is a very good 5.1 mix, and it's also got really great supplements. So this is a stuffed Blu-ray disc of the 2017 documentary, and it's a fantastic watch, and any fan of the film should see this at some point. Now, as I mentioned, the 4th documentary disc is unfortunately exclusive to the limited edition, and the limited edition sold out almost immediately when it was finally available for pre-order. So you can get the essential standard edition of this set, and it will essentially be the case without the wonderful packaging and extras of the limited set. And you'll still get the same amazing, essential, worth their weight in gold discs 1 through 3. It just won't include the 4th documentary disc. That's the only thing that you lose in terms of disc content on all 3 standard editions of the Arrow Dollars Trilogy releases. The included book for the limited edition is in the same style as the other 2 and runs about 60 pages with fantastic images and new essays. So this is another fantastic Arrow book in their usual wonderful style. And it's really nice that they made sure that all 3 of the books in these sets actually matched up nicely. For GBU, there is a special piece that's really the key part of this whole book. And that's the final About the Versions piece by James Flower, who walks you through the different versions and their variations and some of the video variations and gets into at least some of the nitty-gritty details that went into this whole restoration process. But as I've mentioned in my reviews of these, they could have written a whole book just about the restoration process. And someday I hope they actually do, because this little bit here will whet your appetite and give general audiences more of an idea of what went into this, but this is only scratching the surface. And as Flower points out, we still don't know 100% of all the mysteries of the film in terms of, we don't have all of the elements and not everything survives, and trying to find this stuff only turns up certain bits and odds and ends. And just when you think you've found out everything and you know everything about the film, some little scrap of footage turns up, or a still with part of a deleted scene appears, or a foreign print turns up with a slightly different edit or a little bit of extra footage previously unknown. So there's always something new with these films that turns up. And then we also have a lovely fold-out poster with a copy of the fantastic Tony Stella artwork from the interior case, which is reversible with a reproduction of the UA 1967 one-sheet on the back. Overall, the Arrow Video Restoration Project and their physical media releases on Blu-ray, UHD, and in both limited and standard editions are really the game-changing moment for the film on physical media. This is the release we always dreamed of. It's something that all Leone fans would daydream about and just thought impossible due to the rights issues, the different rights holders, the elements being scattered across different countries, and the decades upon decades of preservation problems, element problems, variations, different versions, different cuts, different video mastering approaches, and the various things that then got baked into the film, not to mention the sound issues and the sound remixes. So it was a Gordian knot of problems, and no one had managed to ever cut that Gordian knot of problems, and the Arrow release is what finally does that. It may not be absolutely 100% perfect, but that's not from lack of trying. That is due to the elements involved having to go back to the raw Ritrovata 4K scan and do all the work themselves from there, as opposed to having a brand new 4K negative scan. But if you did a new 4K scan, that would be a very expensive process. The rights holders really don't want to do that, and it's very likely that would not advance much, if at all, over the existing well-done 4K scan. So even though that has a few little quirks here and there, Arrow was able to properly color time this transfer and work on it even further to present the film as best as possible with the elements that survive and what they were given to work with. So this basically goes above and beyond everything that was done on the 2021 Kino release, because Arrow also searched through vault holdings, pulled materials together, got brand new transfers of the original master source of the English dub, and worked with the fan historian and preservation community and used their elements and made it a big collaborative effort. And because of this, the release was actually delayed more than once. And that's, again, because Arrow wanted to make sure that they tried absolutely everything to get this film right in terms of their presentation. They didn't want to have any corners cut. They didn't want to leave any stones unturned. And that's what this release is. This release is finally somebody going in and giving it 200% throughout, working with everyone, whether they're an official studio or rights holder or part of the fan community, and who have done more work in trying to preserve this film over the decades than a lot of the official studio efforts have. And combining all of this and putting in new work and new efforts into getting more materials together and trying to make a presentation that actually represents the film properly and keeps an archival mindset and tries to get the presentation to be as close to the original 1966 and 1967 releases of the film as possible with what materials exist. It's just absolutely miraculous. The color timing is phenomenal throughout. This is the first release of the film on video where I don't have some notes about the color timing somewhere. There is no sign of the crazy Ritrovata color in here because they were able to go back to the actual raw scan files themselves before any of that was done. So that in and of itself puts this beyond the Kino release, but they also went in and did additional work. They basically started from scratch with the raw files and did everything themselves. They also have done their own HDR presentation, so this transfer is available in Dolby Vision, HDR10, and SDR because Arrow makes sure to grade for all three formats. And the HDR, like their other two trilogy releases, is painstakingly done to never be at a revisionist level of being too bright or too dark. There are no issues whatsoever with the HDR presentation, and the Dolby Vision version is superior to the HDR10 iteration, but Arrow makes sure that regardless of whatever your home theater setup is or what equipment you have, whichever of the three presentations you're looking at, you're getting an image that is represented as best as possible. And then you have to look at how Arrow handled the audio of the film. This is a complete restoration of the English mono mix and is the first time that somebody has actually tried to properly restore the mono mix. Arrow also wanted to do the Italian mono, and I guess apparently they had a version in the works or almost finished, and that was when the decision was made that they were not going to be allowed to include that, which is unfortunate. But we do have their new restoration of the English mono mix and a very painstaking, carefully done 5.1 up mix of this mono restoration. Now, as I've said, Arrow was able to get transfers of the surviving original master materials of the English dub itself, but the quality of those was not the greatest, and they had a lot of damage and wear baked in, and a lot of distortion as well. So they tried to use those where they could, but they were significantly lower quality than the actual 1990 Laserdisc mono. So once again, that track is supremely important and really forms the bulk of this restoration, with a lot of careful attention paid to basically looking at all three sources: the 1990 Laserdisc mono, the transfer of the English dub master positive and negative. So those three have been painstakingly brought together, and while the bulk of this track is using the 1990 Laserdisc mono, it has been also properly synced to the film. So the sync is even better than the fan sync that was done and used on the Kino release back in 2021. And it doesn't really have any filtering applied to it, so it also sounds better than the 2021 Kino release. But that's why this 1990 Laserdisc mono is so important and why it's now been utilized twice on different official releases. It would have been obviously more desirable to use the original negative transfer of the English dub, but they basically tried working with it, and they couldn't really get it to the same level of quality as the 1990 Laserdisc audio already was. But I think in various points they were able to use parts of those master transfers and basically create an as best as possible restoration of the English mono from what materials survive, basically using these three sources. And then for the extended cut materials, what Arrow did was actually go back to the 2003 remix from Hell, and obviously they were stuck using the 2003 re-recorded voices, but they have actually gone in and made a very careful mono mix for the actual scenes exclusive to the longer versions, and kept the original sound design of the mono mix, so the original sound effects, the gunshots, everything, and layered in the new voice effects at about the levels they were in the Italian mono mix when you listen to the dialogue in the Italian mono. So they have basically made a purist mono mix for the extended version and done what should have been done back in 2003. It may not be the most historically accurate because you've still got the significantly older voices and things from the 2003 version, but you have none of the other issues from the 2003 5.1 remix, and so when you watch the long version, you don't have to deal with any of the pains of the revisionism that MGM carried out, except that Arrow was limited in that they had to once again use the 2003 voice recordings. But it is in and of itself itself a beautifully done piece of audio restoration and presentation, and that's just for the extended cut presentations. But it is just incredible that the audio has been given this level of attention, because it almost never gets attention. And these films have had their original mono mixes torn apart and remixed and overprocessed to within an inch of their life in the past decades. And then the 5.1 remix is another of Arrow's very carefully done upmixes of their new restoration mono. And so for all three of their Dollars Trilogy releases, the 5.1 tracks keep the front and center oriented feeling of the original mono mix. There's very little to no surround activity, so it's not spreading the sound behind you when it shouldn't, like almost all 5.1 upmixes do. There is only a limited general expansion of the sound into the left and right main channels and LFE enhancement for the bigger moments and bigger music cues, but it always keeps the original sonic intent of the single channel mono mix, thus preserving Sergio Leone's intricate sound design. You do always lose something whenever you go away from the original mono mix itself, but if you're going to have an upmix of a mono track, it should be done in this way. A very carefully done transfer of the original mono experience into a multi-channel container without ever messing around with the actual sound emphasis for each scene by having the placements go all over the place, or by purposely having the placements and the effects and the levels go all over the place. So this is a perfect translation of the mono mix, but I would always encourage people to just stick with the original mono mix itself. The encoding on all the discs is superb, with the feature discs again being encoded by Fidelity and Motion. All of the legacy extras are here, so you don't have to hang on to any past releases, and unlike both of the Kino releases, this actually makes sure that they are properly presented with the correct frame rate and are upscaled properly, so they look, sound, and play the way that they are supposed to. And we get a plethora of priceless new extras, interview after interview, analysis piece after analysis piece, pieces that pick up on previous extras from the other two releases, so you can watch all three extras across the releases and see those specific things then tailored for that film, so each film gets its own time of focus. Additionally, restorations of priceless trailers that include some of our only glimpses of footage from the famous lost deleted materials, and even an entire gallery of deleted and alternate materials, including extraordinarily rare pieces of the film that were deleted or not used that only survive in one source. Even if it's just a small extra piece, that has been included. Plus, we get an inclusion of a reconstruction of the Bones in the Desert deleted sequence and a restoration of the uncut torture sequence in the Betterville prison camp. And if that were not enough, we have 5 different iterations of the long version of the film on disc 2 to give somebody whichever iteration of the long version they prefer, with or without the grotto scene, with or without the uncut torture sequence. Or if you really want the full experience, you can watch the warts and all version, as I like to call it. And this is included as an Easter egg, but it is easily accessible from the main menu. And on top of that, if you're able to get a copy of the limited edition, Arrow also did a beautiful job at presenting the Great Sad Hill Unearthed documentary with a maxed out bit rate, a 5.1 surround track, and fantastic extras on that disc as well. So to go through this whole set, it will take you a substantial amount of time, because there are hours upon hours of legacy materials, hours upon hours of new extras, all 3 pre-existing audio commentaries, and the documentary, plus the extras on the documentary. So it will take you several days, a week, 2 weeks, maybe even a month if you have to spread it all out just to go through every aspect of this set. And it's one of those releases where you really just marvel at what can be achieved when people really put their minds to something and are able to get rights holders to agree enough to allow them to do this. And when an entity doing a project like this actually tries to collaborate with everyone to make a release as comprehensive as possible, because this is also about preserving the film itself and trying to correct all the mistakes and the wrongs of the past that have attached themselves to the film or been conformed to the film itself and thus dragged the film down for all these decades. So it's crazy to think that it has taken from 1981 roughly to 2025 to get a release that finally tries. So this 2025 Arrow Video restoration and release is really the first time somebody has come into the mad odyssey of GBU variations and presentation history being convoluted and screwy as hell, and actually put in 1,000% in trying to address every problem and work with the elements that they have and find everything else that survives and work with all entities, both rights holders and official studios and the fan preservation community and the fan historians, to try to make something as comprehensive as possible, to try to get it as right as possible, doing their due diligence in all areas, and providing something that makes fans feel validated for buying the film once again by properly presenting every single legacy extra and going overboard and presenting new, incredible supplements that also give us just incredible rare pieces of material, such as the deleted scenes and the surviving trailers. Whether you have the standard or limited edition, they are really the only releases that could be called truly archival of this film on physical media. It's the first and only time where every single aspect was given full attention, and it is such an incredible package overall that it's just something you marvel over, and just holding it in your hands or watching through the entirety of the set, which again will take quite some time just to get through every piece that Arrow has put into this. You hold this release in your hands and you feel like pinching yourself because you think you're dreaming. I've admittedly done that. It's something that I never thought possible. It's something that all Sergio Leone fans or fans of this film never really thought possible, especially if you know anything about the beyond convoluted presentation and video history of this film, which is even more complicated than the other Dollars Trilogy films. For years, I've always said that Leone's films were cursed in their presentation and video history, because it seemed like there was no way they were ever going to get a presentation that fixed as many things as possible and tried its darndest to get everything right. So it's like the films were cursed to video and film hell forevermore. And with these Arrow releases, that has finally ended for the iconic Dollars Trilogy. So when you look back at the overall video history of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it's quite ridiculous that we had to wait 44 years to get this Arrow video release, to get anything with this level of care and attention put into it, in spite of multiple new scans and transfers and official restoration attempts and the 2003 MGM efforts. But in spite of it taking such an absurdly long time to get a release that was worthy of the film it was presenting, we now finally have one. And so if you have not purchased the Arrow video release, you truly must. Even if you have missed out on the limited edition, the standard edition is available and is just... really, it's the only release you need on your shelf. You can replace every single past edition you have. The only things you might want to hang on to, if you're like me and you have way too many releases of these films, is the 1990 Laserdisc for its all-important audio track, or if you have the 1993 box set repressing of that. Like the other two films, I think it's also important to hang on to the earliest video master, just to have the initial roughest iteration, which is also the most hands-off presentation, whether you've got one of the CBS Fox releases or whichever format you've got it on. But outside of those two things, and having nostalgia for the history of screwy video releases that you've spent your life watching, there is no reason to have anything outside of the Arrow release. So you can just get the Arrow release and finally have one copy of the film on your shelf that has all the extras, no video problems, no audio problems, no issues whatsoever in terms of disc encoding and presentation, and gives you any version of the film you really want to see, short of having the Italian mono and the technically Italian theatrical version. And again, that was basically taken out of Arrow's hands. So that is the overall home video history of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly on physical media. It's frankly ridiculous that it's taken about 44 years to get a release that's, worthy of the film that it contains, but we now have that on the Arrow version. And if I have not convinced you already in these two admittedly long videos I've done on this film and its Arrow release, please just go and get a copy of the standard Arrow version. You will not regret it, and you will be able to basically replace every version of the film you have on your shelf. It is a stupendous release, even in just the standard version without the fantastic fourth documentary disc and the wonderful limited edition goodies. These discs are worth their weight in gold, and the amount of work and effort and care put into them, I mean, it just comes across when you're going through every aspect, even down to the clips chosen for the menus. It's just, it just screams the amount of love and affection for Sergio Leone's work in these iconic films that went into this release, and trying to deal with the decades upon decades of problems that these films have faced. The Arrow release is, of course, a Region B title, so you will have to go to one of our fine import retailers if you don't order from Arrow directly, and you will need region-free capability for all of the Blu-ray discs, but this is certainly the release you go region-free for if you haven't already. It's much cheaper and easier to do now than it was years ago, and when someone goes to efforts like this, it's best to support them, because you are certainly not going to get anything like this level of care on any other version of the film that exists on physical media, because nothing else compares. It's as simple as that. So as always, I hope my babblings about the incredible artistry of Sergio Leone's films and their never-ending myriad of issues on physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I will have links below to where you can pick up the Arrow standard release should you wish to do so, and you really need to. It's that important. In any case, please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc, because you are supporting astonishing restoration efforts like the Arrow restorations of the Dollars Trilogy in purchasing these releases. You're not only giving your financial support, but you're supporting further incredible efforts, and we can only hope that Arrow someday might be able to tackle some of the other extraordinarily troubled Leone films in terms of their presentations. Fingers crossed for DocuSucker, please. I'm not begging. Okay, yes, I am begging. I'm really begging, because that film has the worst problems of all. Also, in buying physical media releases, you're not only helping physical media to survive and thrive, but also ensuring that film culture itself is kept alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. You see, there's two kinds of people in this world, my friend. Those with the Arrow Video 4K restoration of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and those who dig through the past craptastic video releases. You dig. The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, the MGM, the Italian rights holders, the Film Preservation War, the Good, the Bad, the Ugly, the questions, the answers, the showdown, the reason, the 4K gold.